Hi everybody, welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. In this video, we're going to take a walk at Mount Pisgah in Iowa. This was an important way station for the Saints as they were making their way from Illinois to Utah. And in my mind, this is a twin of Adam-ondi-Ahman because it has a large valley that looks very similar to the valley of Adam-ondi-Ahman, and both valleys are connected by the Grand River. I think it's pretty unusual actually, but if you want to see the full video, go to my channel called Explore Church Sites, where I give commentary and we read the signs and the historical markers and everything. But in this video, I want to talk about President Nelson because today he turns 101. And happy birthday, President Nelson. And you guys, ever since I've started this channel, I have really looked very closely at this prophet and his presidency, and actually just his life. And this is a prophet unlike any other. He truly is. This has never happened before. We've never had a prophet in this dispensation reach this age. In fact, when he turned 98, that's when he broke the record for the oldest living prophet or apostle in this dispensation. So it's very unusual. We haven't seen it before. It's getting a lot of attention. And not only that, but he happens to be, and it's not by coincidence, I don't think, he is essentially the one prophet in our dispensation that's been the most focused on the second coming. They've all spoken about the second coming to one degree or another, but not like President Nelson. Hopefully that's obvious and clear to everybody. And you also have this unusual thing going on where you have him and President Oaks that were called at the same time. Now, there have been other times where multiple prophets were called at the same time, but theirs happened under very unusual circumstances. So the two who passed away before them died exactly 1 year apart. On January 11th of 1983 and then January 11th of 1984. Those were the circumstances in which President Nelson and President Oaks were called. This was during the time of President Kimball. We've gone over the story many times. There was a flood, a very unusual flood in downtown Salt Lake in between those two deaths. But they became apostles at the same time. And now President Nelson is the president of the church and President Oaks is his first counselor. And the way that it turns out is that President Nelson was a heart surgeon in his career. He worked on people's hearts. And we've talked about the symbolism of him being, the heart surgeon or working on the heart of the church, working on Zion, a people that are pure in heart, one in mind. And then we don't know when he's going to pass away or if he is going to pass away before the second coming. He may be the first one, and I tend to think this, he may be the first one to experience the new type of passing or the new type of death, which is you change in the twinkling of an eye from mortality to immortality. That's the way it's going to be in the millennium. And so if he's the heart surgeon, President Oaks, he's the judge. That's what he did for his career. He was on the Utah Supreme Court, and he actually didn't want to leave that career when he was called to be an apostle, but he did what was right and he followed the promptings of the Spirit. But I feel like that's what we have in store. I feel like that's the phase that we're in. And President Nelson keeps getting older and older, but at the same time, I think we're getting closer and closer to that transition point. I tend to think, like I've said before, I feel like the story of Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and then finally reaching the promised land, I feel like that's a foreshadowing of this last dispensation, in that the entering of the promised land is like us entering into the millennium when the righteous inherit the earth and Christ becomes king of the earth, the literal political king. And what happened in that story is you had Moses that was really old at the time that he brought Israel to the promised land. He himself did not enter the promised land. He saw it, but he was translated. And then it was Joshua who led Israel into the promised land. They come to Jericho. That's the first time that you see 7 trumpets. And there's the story of the fall of Jericho, which I feel is a foreshadowing of the fall of this world, the fall of the political kingdoms, of the earth right now as they give way to God's kingdom. And then you also had Caleb. Those three are the only three that survived the 40 years. The only ones who had actually lived in Egypt, who were then at that point where they saw and entered into the promised land. In the case of Joshua and Caleb, they actually entered the promised land. So I think that's what we're seeing. Only time will tell. But some other things with President Nelson, it's very interesting that he started his presidency by going on a global ministry tour, and he wanted to go to Jerusalem. He said he wanted to basically start his ministry in Jerusalem. He recorded a new video for his Special Witness of Christ to replace the old one now that he's president of the church. We've talked recently about how that's really interesting. It was under his presidency that the renovation of the Salt Lake Temple was announced. And for the better part of his presidency, it's been in this state of renovation. We're still waiting to rededicate it, most likely in 2027. That's when the open house is going to be anyway, but I think it's going to be dedicated in the last part of 2027. It was in his presidency that the Rome, Italy temple was dedicated. Not only that, he's the first president of the church to have met with a sitting pope. And he called that dedication a hinge point in the history of the church. So that was a really big deal. He included a picture of the Rome, Italy temple in his Second Coming talk of October 2024. Around that same time, in General Conference, that's when he said that time is running out. And you just have to see how he says it, listen to his voice, look at his facial expressions. He meant it. Here we are. All these years later, in 2026, that's going to be 7 years from the time that he said time is running out. But this just is really on my mind as he's hitting all these record-breaking, or as he's like getting older and older and just taking this record further and further out. It was during his presidency that we had the COVID-19 pandemic and everything that happened in 2020, including the April 2020 General Conference, in which the new church symbol was announced. We got a new proclamation. We did a Hosanna shout and other special things. In 2022, October, that's when he called on us to be the people of the second coming, something that I've never seen any other prophet explicitly do the way that he did. In 2024, the Kirtland Temple came back into the church, which to me is just stunning. It's still mind-blowing. I never thought that I would see that in my lifetime, or that I'd have to wait until the millennium, but it happened. And then just a month later, there was a total solar eclipse that went over the Kirtland Temple. The path of totality went over the Kirtland Temple just a month after it was purchased by the church, in the day after General Conference, no less. So we've also seen these incredible signs in the heavens, including the total solar eclipses. The first one in 2017, just a year before he became president of the church, went over Jackson County, Davies County, Caldwell County, okay, the major sites here in Missouri. The path of totality went over those. And it had to take that exact path in order to cover all of those. It couldn't have varied by more than just like a mile or two. And then the one in 2024, like I said, it went over the Kirtland Temple as well as the Sacred Grove. Even though time has passed, I don't think that we should discount how special that was and how much of a sign I believe that was. But we've had other things. We've had these different lunar events. I have a spreadsheet for it. It started right after President Nelson became president of the church. So he became president of the church on January 14th of 2018. And I don't have my spreadsheet up right now, but I think it was 17 days later, which he is the 17th president of the church. That's when you had a super blue blood moon, meaning that you had those three events going together at the same time, which is very, very rare. And I have a whole list of things. I'm not going to list them here. In 2024, we saw two major aurora events where the aurora was seen in the entire United States. I saw it both times in Kansas, of all places. And then President Nelson, he's announced a very, very large number of temples, another record-breaking event. In fact, he dedicated the 200th temple of the church. You'll remember that President Hinckley wanted to have 100 temples dedicated by the end of the year 2000. Well, President Nelson, less than 25 years later, got us to 200 operating temples. It was during his presidency that the war in Ukraine broke out, and then a little bit more recently, the war in Israel, which neither one of those wars have been resolved yet, and we don't really know where it's headed or how much longer they're going to last. I still think that the war in Israel could turn out to be the final war as things escalate. We've seen some major escalations, including a big one between Israel and Iran itself, which involved ballistic missiles and bombing different sites in Iran, including by the United States with B-2 bombers from Missouri, of all places, because that's where the B-2s are based out of. I don't think that story is over yet. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does, but it's not over yet. And then we've seen this like really interesting thing with President Nelson's talks. It turns out that his 70th talk, exactly 70, his 70th talk was his last talk that he gave before becoming president of the church, when he was still president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And his big second coming talk, when you look at all of his talks and you look at each seventh talk, like every 7 talks, and you mark them, his second coming talk was a multiple of 7 out of all the talks that he's given since he became president of the church, but also since becoming an apostle back in 1984. There was a lot to highlight that talk, including the fact that in October of 2024, that's when he wrote his Liahona article. He usually just does one a year in the Liahona. And then we got another one from him in January, which was a very, like, relatively speaking, it was a very short time later to have two articles from him in the Liahona in such a short space of time. It's the shortest that we've seen. I don't know if there's a reason behind that, but I tend to think that we're in a very important time right now. I think that's why. And then we've seen a lot of things happening in Missouri lately. We've had a changing of the guard with Community of Christ. They now have their first ever female prophet president, Stacey D. Cram. During that world conference where that was taking place, there was an Aurora event, as well as a tornado that struck here in Independence. And from what I can tell from that one website that we were looking at, these 2 tornadoes are the closest tornadoes to the temple lot since, I can't remember how far back it went. I think it went back to 1950. There's kind of like this area in Independence that hasn't seen a tornado at all since 1950. It's like this, almost like a bubble protecting the city. But these 2 have gotten the closest from what I saw on that map. But it interrupted their world conference. Everybody had to take shelter. I was on my way back home, and we actually took shelter in the Independence Visitor Center because I couldn't get home in time. But we've seen that, and I think that the fact that we have this new prophet president of Community of Christ, I think it's going to be good for the church, because I feel like the direction that she wants to take the church is further and further away from the traditional beliefs of, back when they were the RLDS church. We've seen a lot of growth in Missouri. I could go on, but just the point is, and I haven't covered everything, obviously. This is not meant to be a comprehensive video, but those are some of the big things that have taken place during President Nelson's presidency. A lot of them unprecedented. We'd never seen it before. And every year that goes by, if he continues to live for more years, every birthday that goes by, like I've pointed out in a recent video, is going to bring more and more and more attention to the church. I feel like his life is being extended. I feel like President Oak's life is being extended. Possibly President Eyring, and definitely President Holland. Again, are we looking at the Moses, Joshua, and Caleb? I think that we are. I really do. But we'll just have to see. But we're in exciting times. That's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.